This is chapter 7 of MacArthur's book, 12 Unlikely Heroes. This chapter is on Esther. Esther for such a time as this. Many of you may be familiar with Esther 4:14, where Mordecai tells Esther she's a little reluctant to go into the king to speak on behalf of her people, the Jew. And he says, who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this, or come into the kingdom for such a time as this. If you haven't read through Esther recently, you might want to go ahead and pause the video or come back at another time after you read through those 10 short chapters to get the background, to refresh yourself on the story of Esther. Part of the background of Esther is the Persian Empire, which would be basically modern Iran, actually. The king Xerxes I, whose title comes over in your English Bible actually as Ahasuerus. He lived in 519 to 465 BC. Also, King Cyrus is connected to this as well. He was a previous king of this empire, mentioned in Ezra 1 and also prophesied about in the Old Testament. At any rate, Esther is also, of course, she is the main protagonist in the story, although ultimately God is the invisible hand in the story, the God of providence. The story really is about God's providence in the work over the nations, over empires, over everything. There's also Mordecai, Esther's kinsman, who basically raises her as the orphan girl, encourages her to do what's right in the sight of God, regardless of the cost. Then there's the ultimate, the main antagonist is Haman, who hates the Jews and tries his hand at a pogrom against the Jews. And so you see one of several attempts to exterminate the Jews throughout biblical history, not to mention those post-Bible, post-New Testament times, those who have attempted to wipe out the Jews as well. Even in our day and time as well, terrorist groups try to do that and even chant slogans that mention that. But God is not done with the Jew. He promised them as long as the stars and the elements are hanging out there in the sky, the Jew will not cease to be a people before God. So they're not going anywhere. God's hand is on them. So, we need to understand that fact. So we're talking around the 5th century BC. Also, I want to mention an interesting thing about Haman while we're at it and the pogroms against the Jews. Haman was an Agagite. It mentions that several times here in Esther. So if you look, for instance, at chapter 3, verse 1, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. And if you follow your marginal references, if you have a reference Bible, or you can certainly just check it out, you'll see that the Agagites had been enemies with the Jews a long time. It goes all the way back to a pretty popular, famous example in the Old Testament in Samuel, where Saul where he actually spared the king of Agag, the Agagites, and King Saul spared his life, but the prophet Samuel hacked Agag to pieces, if you remember that part of the story. So this was an ongoing, centuries-long, what we call bad blood between these two people groups. And so here Haman's going to try his attempt. He has an opportunity to exterminate the Jews, and so he's going to try to do it. When you get to Esther 4:14, you have an indirect affirmation of divine sovereignty. As MacArthur says on page 139, Mordecai he encourages Esther that who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this, right? This is the very reason you were born. You need to get at it. God's called you to this. Let's go for it, okay? All right, so let's go back to the beginning. So page 127, MacArthur gives you some great historical background. The Persian or Achaemenid Empire stretched from modern-day Libya and Africa to Pakistan and Asia. It was the largest empire in history up to that point, with about 50 million people residing within its borders. After having conquered the Babylonian or Chaldean Empire in 539 BC, the Persians settled into domination over the Middle Eastern world for 2 centuries. And then the regions of Greece had been conquered by the Persians under Darius I, but they were defeated at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. Darius was determined to subdue his Greek enemies, but he wasn't able to because he died, and the quest for revenge fell to his son Xerxes I. Xerxes also fought the Greeks, but the Greeks ultimately defeated the Persians in 479 and in 480. And he mentions the 300 Spartans and that issue, famous battles in ancient history. So Xerxes was forced to flee back to Persia with most of his army, he says at the top of page 129. And then, of course, 150 years later, under Alexander the Great, the Persians would be defeated for good, because you move on into then the Greek Empire and then the Roman Empire and so on to the time after Jesus Christ. Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, had a large, a massive empire. Esther chapter 1, verse 1 says he reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. So he's going to throw a huge banquet. It lasted 7 days, and he wants his wife, Queen Vashti, to come out and entertain the men, whatever that meant. She wasn't going to do it. She refused. So some of his advisors said, look, we can't have this woman doing this. All the women in the empire will get rebellious toward their husbands or something like that. So, chapter 1, toward the end of the chapter. So she's kicked out of the palace, literally. And it goes on probably another couple years as MacArthur accounts the time. And they finally hold a beauty pageant for his next queen. Basically, Esther wins the contest. She's a young Jewish girl. The Jews are living in the empire, and she is taken to be queen. She wins the contest. Chapter 2, verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his princes and his servants. He also made a holiday for the princes and gave gifts according to the king's bounty. Then Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate. Evidently, he worked for the administrative cabinet. And Esther had not yet made known her kindred or her people, even as Mordecai had commanded her. And while he was sitting at the king's gate, 221, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's officials from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So Mordecai foils a plot, sends message to Ahasuerus to save his life from this coup. These guys were going to kill him. And so Mordecai has saved the king's life. Chapter 3, after these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him, established his authority over all the princes who were with him. And Haman already hated the Jews, evidently, but Mordecai especially, and now he wants to rub it in that probably that he's been promoted. He actually wants Mordecai to bow before him. Chapter 3, verse 2, 3, and 4, Mordecai would not bow down or pay homage to Haman. This made him extremely, verse 5, the end of the verse says, Haman was filled with rage. And so he urges the king to sign an edict. There's a certain people group within the kingdom that hate you. They don't bow to you. We need to get them, get rid of them. So the king signs an edict, that these people are going to be slaughtered within a certain amount of time, or starting in a certain amount of time. So Mordecai hears of this, and then he is, he's just devastated. He and his people are going to be wiped out. So again, he's going to try to send message, but not to the king. He wants to get the message to Esther so that she will get that to her husband, to the king. So page 134, his section title is Mordecai Foils a Sinister Plot. Yep. Next page, Haman hatches a diabolical plan. Yes. And MacArthur, top of page 136, it's back to the Agagite issues. To get to the point, we need to understand that the hostility between the Agagites and the Jews went back almost 1,000 years to the Exodus, actually. Around 1445 BC, Exodus 17. Also, God cursed the Amalekites, prophesying that one day they would become extinct, Deuteronomy 25:17. 4 centuries later, King Saul conquered the Amalekites and captured their king, whose name was Agag, 1 Samuel 15. Haman was a descendant of Agag who carried long-nurtured feelings of intense hatred toward the Israelites because they had defeated the Amalekites and put Agag to death. MacArthur goes on, the plot thickens when we realize also that Mordecai was a descendant of Kish, Esther 2 verse 5, right? So it goes back to Saul's kinsman, a man from the tribe of Benjamin who was from the line of Saul. Though 550 years had passed since Saul and Agag, neither Haman the Agagite nor Mordecai the Benjamite, descendant of Saul, had forgotten the tribal feud that still smoldered deep beneath the surface, end quote. So it comes to a point here in chapter 3 in the first several verses. So, as he says in the middle of page 137, Haman hits the fast track to get rid of the Jews. One piece of information that Mordecai has forgotten or doesn't know actually or didn't consider was that Esther was a Jew. That one little piece of the puzzle is going to be his Achilles heel, right? As you probably know. Chapter 4, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, went out to the middle of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. He went as far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. So Esther hears that her cousin Mordecai, who basically has raised her, is in this sort of turmoil. That causes her grief as well. So she sends to find out what's up with him. And the messenger came back with a message. And her message to him was, look, I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. Esther 4:11. They related Esther's words to Mordecai. Mordecai sends a message back to her again. Verse 13, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. And so he's letting her know, a couple things, a warning here that, look, you're Jew too. You're not going to escape this command to wipe out the Jews. But also he says, look, God's got you here for a purpose. Now, understandably, top of 139, MacArthur says, quote, the queen was understandably afraid of her potentially violent and irrational husband, right, because of his track record, actually, who had demoted and publicly disgraced Vashti for just one act of noncompliance. Mordecai was putting Esther in a position to disregard the law and approach the king uninvited, end quote. So, but Mordecai gives her an indirect affirmation of divine sovereignty, though he did not mention God's name, and God's name is actually not mentioned in this book, though he is the providential hand behind the entire story, right? Moving the pieces from behind the curtain, if you will, right? God is a God of providence. He's absolutely in control, and he's working things to a certain end, a certain purpose, right? God has a purpose for everything and in everything. This is who he is. Bottom of 139, finally embracing her divinely granted role, Esther responded with courage and resolve. Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan or Susa, and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Even if it cost her life, He says Esther would do whatever was necessary to protect her people. Though Esther's reply does not mention prayer, it was traditionally a part of any Jewish fast. So for 3 days, she and her fellow Jews prayed, and as she prepared herself to face the king, end quote. So Esther plans to intercede, and she plans this banquet. So in chapter 5, Esther plans the banquet, and the king acquiesces. He allows her to come forward. He accepts the invitation. She wants his right-hand man Haman to attend the banquet as well. That day, chapter 5, verse 9 and following, Haman is so prideful that he's been invited, to a special exclusive dinner, and he's going to brag to his family and everybody, but he's so pouting. He's pouting such that his family, has to say what's wrong. Verses 12 and 13, he's whining, and his wife and his friends said, "Look, why don't you just build a tall gallows to hang Haman on, and then you go enjoy your banquet with the king and the queen." Chapter 6, during the night, the king could not sleep. So he gave an order to bring the book of records, right, of his kingdom. I guess he needed to be read to sleep, Providence, friend. Providence, my friend. And it was read in a recent events was Mordecai had saved his life sometime in the recent past. He said, what did we ever reward this guy? And so when Haman comes in the next morning, he says, look, it's the day of the banquet. But that morning he says, what would you do, Haman, for, somebody the king wanted to honor? And so he thinks of all these lavish gifts and exciting things, to march him through town, things he could do for him. So he says, well, Haman, you go do that for Mordecai, right? So Mordecai's sinister plot actually backfires, part A, on him at this time. He has to parade Mordecai, the Jew, through the streets with the king's robe and so forth on. Okay? So chapter 7 then, the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen, and then she says, well, I'd like y'all to come back tomorrow night for another banquet. So they come, and on the second night, she says, chapter 7, verse 3, Queen Esther replied, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king. Then King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, who is he and where is he? Who would presume to do this? Esther said, a foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. So the king is so mad at Haman, he has to walk out on the porch to get some fresh air. When he comes back, Haman is kneeling down, begging for his life to Queen Esther. And Haman gets even more mad because, I don't know, maybe it looks inappropriate or something. Anyway, he's just so much more angry now. So he sends him out. They come and put a cloth over, they cover his head, Haman's head, and they march him out. And he is literally hanged on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. So his plan backfires on him. Ultimately, for part B of his plan backfiring. MacArthur says in 144 in the middle of the page, what a difference a day makes. 24 hours earlier, Haman had been at the top of his political career, boasting to family and friends about his royal success and happily plotting the demise of his arch nemesis Mordecai along with the Jews. That was yesterday. Today, the king would execute him as an enemy of the state, end quote. Now, there's an issue here, interestingly enough, that the king's edict, right? You've heard of the law of the Medes and Persians. The king's edict for the Jews to be killed could not be reversed, and the king knew that. But what he did do here, because Esther, well, actually, first of all, in chapter 8, verse 7, King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given the house of Haman to Esther, and him they have hanged on the gallows because he has stretched out his hand against the Jews. Now you write to the Jews as you see fit in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for a decree which is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring may not be revoked. So the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces which extended from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to every province according to its script, and to every people according to their language, as well as to the Jews according to their script and their language. He wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and in it he granted the Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble and to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil. And on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, 13th day of the 12th month, a copy was sent, and they ended up killing thousands of those who tried to destroy them. So the way the king got out of the first edict was saying, hey, the Jews are allowed to defend themselves. And they had time to get ready, actually, if you'll note the chronology in here, to defend themselves. Chapter 8, verse 15, Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a large crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. Listen, this is a biblical principle in the Old and the New Testament. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, and he will exalt you in due time. Okay? God is a God of providence. That is the point of this story. That is the point of the book of Esther. Interestingly, chapter 8, verse 16, for the Jews, there was light and gladness and joy and honor. There was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many among the peoples of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. And so, chapter 9, verse 1, in the middle of the verse, it was turned to the contrary, so that the Jews themselves gained the mastery over those who hated them. It was turned to the contrary. Instead of those people slaughtering the Jews, it happened to them. Again, this is the providence of God. God sets up the nations and peoples he wants to, period. And he gives the number of those Persians who were killed. And chapter 9, verse 20, then Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent out, and they created a holiday. This is the Feast of Purim, the Hebrew word for a lot, because the lots were cast to try to get rid of the Jews on what day or whatever they were going to get rid of the Jews. You read that earlier. I bypassed that part. But they cast lots, which today's day would be similar to like rolling dice. Let's see which day, which month, or whatever scenario was that we're going to get rid of Haman and the Jews. Okay, so because it was turned to the contrary, and Haman, who was trying to wipe out the Jews, was himself executed, along with tens of thousands of others with him, then Mordecai commanded a holiday called the Feast of Lots. So a pur, P-U-R, in Hebrew is a lot. A Purim, that's the plural of this term. The Feast of Purim is the Feast of Lots. And Jews still celebrate that to this day. Now, Purim and Hanukkah happened, Purim and Hanukkah were not commanded by God in the 7 feasts or holidays in Leviticus 23. But they've been added through history because of major events in the history of the Jew, the deliverance of the Jew here in Esther, and also at the time of the Maccabees, 165 BC, so a century and a half before the time of Christ. So that now, Jews would have 9 major holidays after that. Of course, now they have Independence Day, and there's several other holidays on their calendar now. But I'm just saying there were 7 official biblical or Feast of God, and there were 9 total in ancient times for Feast of Israel. In chapter 9, verse 25, when it came to the king's attention, he commanded by letter that his wicked scheme which he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Okay, Mordecai is rehearsing what had happened and why we're doing the holiday. Therefore, they call these days Purim after the name of Purim because of the instructions in this letter, both what they had seen in this regard and what had happened to them. So it would return on his own head. Also, another biblical principle throughout the Bible, actually. Chapter 10 only has 3 verses. Mordecai the Jew was promoted, was second only to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews and in favor with his many kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people and one who spoke for the welfare of his whole nation. There's a biblical principle as well given in Jeremiah 29, verse 7. Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will have welfare. So this is exactly what Mordecai did. And this brings us to another lesson of Christians and politics, actually. Christians and politics, and Christians in politics. Notice that Joseph was one of God's people. He was in the highest ranks in the land. Daniel, same thing. The prophets of the Old Testament almost always went into the capital city, Jerusalem, and directed their message to the king and to all the politicians gathered. Okay, the message from God was meant to be applied to the administration of the civil government. They made efforts to influence the governmental authorities and the citizens at large. Jesus said to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. In a democratic republic like the United States, voting is something we're supposed to be doing and getting involved in. We ought to vote, contact our representatives that we have voted in to voice our support of and our opposition to particular laws that our support of laws that are in keeping with biblical values and our opposition to laws that are contrary to biblical values. Hence, every Christian should be pro-life. It is a biblical value not to kill babies. Okay? It is a biblical value for a nuclear family and heterosexuality for a man and woman in marriage. These are biblical values. It is a biblical value to work for your daily bread, to earn it. That's a biblical value. It is a biblical value to defend the helpless. That's a biblical value. The Apostle Paul also spoke to kings. Notice his testimony to kings and others in authority throughout the book of Acts. The early church pastors, theologians, Christians also made efforts to influence their governments. They sought the welfare or the good of their people. What is good for human flourishing is that which God has designed and given in his revelation in Scripture. That's why Judeo-Christian principles from the Bible are the way to go. So Mordecai was highly esteemed because he worked for the good of his people. He did not think only of his own advancement or even of his own family. He spoke up for the welfare of the Jews. Many times it's dangerous to speak up in a hostile environment. But God needs servants today who will speak up when his people are in danger or when injustice and corruption are rampant in society. And of course, Esther herself was in the highest ranks of government at the time, and she spoke up for biblical values. She spoke up for the people of God. She spoke up for what was right. Christians today should do no less than that. Look at MacArthur's page 147. Where is God in the Book of Esther? The real hero of this story is never mentioned, never even named, he says. But every reader knows who he is and sees his heroic acts of power. God himself is the only explanation for the survival of the Jews in the midst of such hatred and opposition. His hand of providence is in every large event and every small detail as he protects and preserves his people. Song of Solomon and Esther are the only books of the Bible where no reference to God is made. This has understandably caused some readers of Scripture to wonder, why would the Persian king be referenced over 175 times while the divine king is not mentioned once? He says, but his presence comes through more powerfully and more dominantly because it's so obvious that only God could sovereignly ordain everything in the story of Esther. His providence is at work in the fact that of the 25 million women in the Persian Empire, Esther, a Jew, was chosen as the queen, number one. Number two, Mordecai's stumbling upon a plot to assassinate the king. Number three, that night that the king could not sleep, and so he was reminded about Mordecai. And number four, that would help his attitude toward the Jews here within the next day or two of that, actually, right? Within a number of hours. And Haman's timing was perfect, except in the exact opposite way he intended. So there's four major points of how God's providential hand is at work in the life of Esther, in the life of the Jew, in the life of the nation, in the life of the individuals there, those who were faithful to him, and also those who hated him. And he cites wisely here Proverbs 16:33, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. Top of 48, MacArthur says, the absence of God's name is undoubtedly, quote, undoubtedly intentional. It is part of a startling yet genius literary strategy that actually draws the reader to think deeply about God. The omission is so glaring that the silence screams for our attention and compels us to take notice. There are too many coincidences to happen randomly. This amazing narrative calls for a designer, a coordinator, and it is God, end quote. And then he says, next paragraph, though it is silent as to his name, God thunders through the book of Esther, end quote. He mentions on 149, through Haman, quote, through Haman, Satan attempted to put the Abrahamic and Davidic promises to Israel in jeopardy, citing Genesis 17, 2 Samuel 7 for the Davidic covenant, Davidic and Abrahamic promises. But against the backdrop of heinous evil, both God's covenant love for Israel and his power to protect them shone brightly in spectacular ways. Today, as the drama of world events continues to unfold and evil powers in the Middle East threaten the existence of Israel again, just as European powers did in the days of Hitler and Stalin, the Lord will preserve the Jews for final salvation in the future. The kingdom he has promised to them through his prophets will come, as the Apostle Paul explained in Romans 11:26, and so all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come to Zion, and he will turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins, for the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, end quote. So God is still on the throne, and that's a great comfort to all those who trust in him. See Isaiah 40 as well for another biblical notion about God being sovereign over all things. I recommend to you R.C. Sproul's book, The Invisible Hand, which talks about the providence of God. Also, John Piper's The Swans Are Not Silent series. That's a great little read, those small books. Each one deals with a very concise history of three men and women throughout church history that God worked through them mightily to bring revival, to bring encouragement, to bring the Word of God to bear on different cultures, hymnary as well. And so I commend those to you as well. Be sure to check out the next video on chapter 8, John the Baptist, and check out the previous 6 videos on each of the chapters in this book of MacArthur's titled 12 Unlikely Heroes. I'm the Bible Professor. Be blessed.